Recently, a paper came out from South Korea that analyzed the cancer rates based on vaccination status. This is a topic that I know is of a lot of interest to many of you, and I recently did one video already analyzing this type of population study for cancer incidence rates. That one was in one of the provinces of Italy. And soon after, a few months after, this paper came out that looked at what right now looks like the largest population study of its kind, comparing unvaccinated versus vaccinated in terms of what it might mean for cancer incident rates. So let's go over it. My name is Dr. Mikola Rashik of Genomics. Let's get started. And this was, as I mentioned, the largest one I'm aware of so far. I'm sure we'll have many of these type of videos moving forward, publications and videos moving forward. This is now the second one I'm aware of where it looks at, just compares populations like that, vaccines versus non-vaccinated individuals. Of course, we're talking about COVID-19 vaccines. And this one analyzed entire population of Seoul, the capital of South Korea, and that included registry of about 8.4 million people. The reason why the study was possible is because there's a single payer insurance in South Korea. It's Korean National Health Insurance, whatever it's called, and according to the article, about 98% of all individuals are included in this data in Seoul. So very comprehensive data. And these authors did two comparisons. They did the vaccinated versus non-vaccinated. And there's a bit of a confusion there. I'll talk about it in a moment. And they also compared cancer incident rates for 2 versus 3 shots. Okay, so we're gonna go over that as well. So they took that 8.4 million people, divided them in vaccinated versus non-vaccinated. Non-vaccinated were about over 600,000 people. About 8% of the population was not vaccinated in Seoul. So the majority of people were vaccinated, but still left hundreds of thousands of people available for comparison versus literally millions. And then they started excluding certain people and matching them in order for this comparison to be as accurate as possible. So let me tell you about the matching component first. When they did the matching, they matched people for, of course, gender, they matched them for age, they matched them for even their insurance status as well, the level of insurance, and they also matched them for comorbidities. So fairly comprehensive matching in order to make sure that they're comparing apples to apples as accurately as possible. Where it is confusing to me is in terms of what the authors were, why were they excluding people? Where I'm not certain as to what exactly happened is who they compared to. Were the people that were vaccinated with just 2 shots versus any vaccines? I can tell you for sure they excluded anyone who did not have full vaccination status, meaning if you needed 2 shots and you only had 1, those were excluded from the study. They were not included in non-vaccinated. I know a lot of people think that what happens. No, this is not the case. Those were completely excluded from the study, and that was almost 300,000 individuals. So they're gone. They're not even included in the study. They also excluded people who were dead. They were excluded people who, and that was approximately 30,000 people in the vaccinated group. Also, what they did is those who had unspecified vaccine, those were also excluded from the study, and this was approximately 70,000 people. And anyone who had cancer prior to when they wanted to start to make a comparison were also excluded. So that's for the vaccinated individuals. So what does it mean in terms of when they started comparing? For the non-vaccinated individuals, their comparison started from January 2022. And by the way, this entire study was between January 1st of 2021 all the way to end of 2023. So 3 full years of comparison, all right? So for those who are not vaccinated, their study comparison for non-vaccinated for 1 year was start of January 1st, 2022. They wanted to compare what happens to those individuals within 1 year, okay? So that's the start date for non-vaccinated. For the vaccinated individuals, it was a day after their completed vaccination status. So if you needed 2 vaccines, the day after you took your second shot, that's when the comparison started. Now, here's where I'm a bit confused as to what exactly happened there. Because of course, most people would start to be vaccinated in 2021. And they tell us detailed information in terms of those 2 shots. So for example, they tell us in the vaccinated group, about 2/3 of all the people were vaccinated. The first vaccines was Pfizer vaccine. For the second shot, about 3/4 of all people had Pfizer shot, all right? About 81% of everyone, they were vaccinated with mRNA shot. 14% were vaccinated with what they refer to as cDNA vaccine or adenovirus-based vaccines, such as AstraZeneca. And then about 5% were a mixture of the two. So those were the people that were included, and where I'm not certain is whether only people with 2 shots were compared against non-vaccinated, or was it 2 shots and more, but they only give us information on the primary vaccination. That part was not clear at all to me from everything I read in that particular paper. But that is the comparison. So what this means to me is that potentially non-vaccinated people had more time to develop cancer than vaccinated individuals, because again, remember, vaccinated individuals started to be compared the day after they had their second shot, so the day after they completed their primary shots. And that for a lot of those individuals, that could already occur in 2021. The reason why this is important is because the authors mention one of the limitations of the study is the fact that solid cancers require usually about a year for cancer to develop, and that's all they actually looked at. They only looked at, the comparison was only for 1 year. So they mentioned that possibly a lot of cancers could be missed because of the fact that this was not enough time to actually be able to determine whether cancer showed up. But non-vaccinated individuals, as I mentioned, they were started to be looked at from 2022, start of 2022. But nevertheless, that's the type of comparison they did. And let me show you now the first figure of the paper. What did it find? And we're going to focus first on figure B of that paper. And the reason why is because this is where they show you the incident rate throughout their study period. So for non-vaccinated, you see in a solid black line, those are the cancer incidence rates that they had for that first 1 year. The way I understand it, it's entire year 2022. And then you see vaccinated individuals in dotted line, and you can see it's higher. And I assume this can span anywhere starting from 2021 to potentially 2022, because the study period lasted all the way till end of 2023. And you can see that vaccinated individuals had higher incidence rate. The reason why I want to show you this figure first is because of the fact that this allows these authors to then study hazard ratios. What are hazard ratios? In essence, it allows you to see what is the risk of obtaining cancer for one group over another. And of course, in this case, we're looking at risk of individuals who were vaccinated what are their risk in comparison to the risk of vaccinated individuals. So now we're going to look at figure A, and you can see for all of the cancer rates, the hazard ratio is 1.27. Now, before I go on, this figure, you can see there's red lines and black lines and red circles, black circles. The red ones are the only ones that we can determine are clinically significant. Why is this? Is because those lines are confidence intervals. Now, what are those? Confidence intervals show you the range of what is observed that encompasses 95% of entire population study. And you can see there's a line over 1. 1 basically means that there is no difference between vaccinated and non-vaccinated people, right? And if that confidence interval, those lines, were to go below that 1 or above that 1 when we're comparing it, it will no longer be clinically significant. Meaning, if you have cancer way more than, say, vaccinated individuals have cancer more than non-vaccinated, but the confidence level line breaks that 1, we're excluding that. It's just simply not assumed clinically significant. This is why we're only going to focus on the red lines, because in the red lines, the confidence interval is all above 1, meaning this is assumed to be significantly significant or clinically significant result. It also has to have appropriate statistical significance, and in this case, that is also the case. So overall, the vaccinated individuals for all cancers, their hazard ratios was 1.27. What it means is that vaccinated people in this comparison group had 27% more risk of having a diagnosis of cancer than non-vaccinated individuals. And then you can see it across all different cancer types. And only some of them reached that clinical significance, meaning that confidence intervals did not break that 1 point, and it was statistically significant. And these cancers were bladder, thyroid, gastric cancers, colorectal cancers, lung, and prostate. And the hazard ratios were different for these different cancers. So for example, it ranged from 1.2 to all the way to 1.7. So for example, breast cancer, the hazard ratio is 1.2, meaning 20% more risk of being diagnosed with breast cancer if you're vaccinated than not, right? Then you look at, then the next one would be gastric cancers or colorectal cancers. Those hazard ratios is 1.3. Then you have thyroid cancers, that hazard ratio is 1.4. Lung cancer was 1.5 hazard ratio, and the worst one was prostate cancer with approximately about 1.7 hazard ratio. So that is the information that these guys were able to glean from that comparison. They also were looking at that information from the point of view of vaccine type, and you can see, depending on what kind of shot was being used, it also affected the risk differently. So I mentioned for all vaccines, all cancers is 1.7, 1.27, but if you look at cDNA vaccines only, meaning those adenoviral vaccines, they had the highest risk, and that risk approached almost 1.5. Then mixed vaccines was better. That was from memory, I think it was about 1.3, and the best ones or safest ones were actually mRNA vaccines. Their cancer risk was only on 1.2 in comparison to other shots. So 20% higher risk if you had mRNA vaccines only, primary vaccines, than either adenoviral or a mixture. They also showed that they also looked at the gender, as I mentioned, and they were able to show that women were more likely to show higher risk of developing cancer post-vaccination than men. And the greatest risk for in terms of age were the oldest people who were more than 75 years old. But here is one element that was a little bit weird to me, that did it make sense? If you look at that figure, non-vaccinated people who were between 65 to 75 were more likely to develop cancer than people who are over 75. And that sort of doesn't make sense to me. Normally I would expect it the other way around, because the older you are, the greater the risk, the higher the risk you have of developing cancer. So that's the figure they presented in a paper. I've also studied all of their supplementary information, and we can take a look at these as well for those 6 individual cancers, those 6 organs that were being affected. So, for example, we're going to now look at their supplementary information. For thyroid cancers, all type of vaccines were increasing risk of thyroid cancers. Didn't matter which type of vaccine. Then next one would be, I believe it was gastrointestinal, and for gastrointestinal, that one was the cDNA only vaccines were specifically increasing this type of risk. Okay, now let's look at colorectal cancers, and for those it was both the cDNA and the mRNA vaccines that were increasing that risk. Next one would be, I believe next one was lung cancers. Again, cDNA and mRNA were increasing that risk. Then let's move forward. Next one would be, I believe, breast cancer. Breast cancer was the bottom two. So breast cancers were only induced by, or the increased risk that was statistically or clinically significant was for both the mRNA shots as well as the mixtures, okay? The mixed vaccines. And then finally, prostate cancer. Prostate cancer was the cDNA only vaccines. So another way to say it is that cDNA vaccines increase the risk of thyroid, gastric, colorectal, lung, and I believe it was, which one was it? Prostate or breast? I think it was, oh my goodness. It was breast. Good. And then if you look at the mRNA, it would be thyroid, colorectal, lung, and prostate. And then the mixed ones were gastric and breast. Okay, so that's another way to do it. All right, so those are the overall findings from when they compared the non-vaccinated versus vaccinated. I also mentioned that they looked at as well for those who had 2 shots complete and only 2 shots. They were very clear about that, versus those who had 2 shots plus booster. And for booster, the vast majority for booster basically was almost all mRNA shot. There was only few people who had non-mRNA booster, so pretty much 0%. And the vast majority again was the Pfizer mRNA booster. Not the minimal part was Moderna. And this was even more confusing as to how many people, how they were excluding people. But the point here is that the booster increased the risk, specifically for 2 types of cancer. It increased the risk again for the gastric cancer, but it significantly increased the risk for pancreatic cancers. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because recently I also presented the fact that in Japan, they studied pancreatic cancers, and they were able to show that the more shots people were taking, the worse outcomes they had for pancreatic cancers. So there's that correlation here we're seeing between these observations. And that Japanese study specifically mentioned that the potential cause of this was the IgG4 antibodies. So the authors here, they did not mention specifically what were the causes. By the way, just to let you know how many they compared, because they had to do this matching, this specific matching, to make sure that they're really comparing as close as possible, apples to apples. They were comparing somewhere around 590,000 non-vaccinated individuals in the first study versus almost 3 million people, or almost 4 2.4 million vaccinated individuals. So very, very large comparison. And for the 2 shots versus booster only, it was much smaller. It was approximately 300,000 people with 2 shots versus just over 700,000 with the 2 shots plus booster. But nevertheless, this was what they were showing you. They did mention that there are certain limitations here. This is not a study that can tell you whether vaccines cause cancer at all. So this is, you cannot determine the causality here. They did mention that another possibility is that there could be certain biases. One of the biases was selection bias, they mentioned, but they said that's unlikely. And the reason why is precisely because everyone has access to healthcare, and pretty much everyone is using it equally in South Korea, and especially in Seoul, where the access to healthcare is probably the best in the country. So they don't expect that the selection bias, meaning people who are non-vaccinated would not see doctors more as frequently as, say, vaccinated individuals. They don't think that would be a reason as to why they're observing these results, but they do mention that that could be a possibility. But nevertheless, they mentioned that this result should be interpreted with caution, so you cannot draw solid conclusions. Nevertheless, they mentioned that we should be carefully looking at this, and they're calling for other scientists to start investigating this type of phenomenon in greater detail. So, sad news overall, but if I have to fish out some positive news out of it, is that overall, luckily, the cancer incidence is not very high. So what this means is that not a very large proportion of the population typically is expected to be diagnosed with cancer. So even if these results are real, and we can now expect these to be real from now on moving forward, then hopefully these are still small increases, but nevertheless, this starts to suggest that perhaps indeed for whatever reason, vaccination status could be affecting incidence of cancer. And of course, they call that we need to start understanding the mechanisms of this to determine as to what could be happening with these specific COVID-19 vaccines. Remember, these are COVID-19 shots that are being involved here. And they did mention that one of the reasons is it's expected that infection itself can cause cancer as well, can contribute to development of cancer for a variety of reasons. And they mentioned in one of the past studies, spike protein could be one of those key agents, and this is the common denominator here between the vaccinated and non-vaccinated groups as well. All right, that's all I have for you in this video. Please like and share. Please leave a comment. Please comment on some of the question marks I have in terms of what you think, how these groups were actually compared. I wasn't, like, as I mentioned, I wasn't sure if they were comparing people with only 2 shots and 2 shots only, meaning full vaccination, or whether that would mean full vaccinations plus further shots when comparing to the non-vaccinated. That's not how I interpret it. I assume it's only 2 shots, but it wasn't clear to me. So let me know what you think about this study. It's obviously an important one, and I suspect we're going to have more and more such studies comparing non-vaccinated versus vaccinated populations in terms of different condition or disease outcomes. And the last thing I'll mention is please check out my Patreon account as well, where I post additional content that does not make it to YouTube. My supporting patrons usually determine as to which content eventually gets to be distributed on YouTube, but there's also free content for on Patreon as well for you to check out as well. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye everyone.